I still remember a distinct moment at the beginning of this journey. It was probably 4 or 5 years ago. And it was when we were living in Iowa, and I was serving in youth ministry there. And we were leaving for one of the most exciting and probably the biggest, most significant weeks for us of the whole year. And what that week was a Christ in Youth Conference. We actually just happened to be heading out for Holland, Michigan, of all places. I think it was my second time in the state at the time. But it's always a journey in itself. Anytime you load up 30 high school students in like 3 different vehicles, you know there's going to be memories made. You know there's going to be some crazy stories. You know it's going to be some level of journey. Like things like a student coming up to me saying, "I put worms in your room." And I said, "No, you didn't." And then I went to my room and there was worms in my room. There's always different levels of a journey, of adventure, of memories being made. But this particular year, the tone was just a little bit different as we were loading the vehicles. The nature, I guess, of it was just a little bit more solemn, a little more serious. Usually it's all wound up. Everybody's excited to get in the vehicles. And I still remember that the distinct moment I was referring to, that as we started to pull out of the parking lot, I kind of made eye contact with one of my friends who had a student had a child on the trip, and she kind of looked at me like, "If you die with honor." and it was like one of those looks of, "I'm going to go to my prayer closet and I'm going to pray for you 24/7 for this entire trip." And the reason was, we had a larger group, but some were Christians and some weren't Christians. And of some of these students, let me just name some of them. This isn't all of them, but here's some of the stories that were taking place within the journeys of their lives. One student, just within a few weeks prior to this trip, their family had completely fallen apart due to some moral decisions that one of the parents had made. And so the rest of the family had actually left the state. Their whole family had just kind of crumbled. One student on the trip was pregnant. 2 students within the previous couple of months had tried to take their own life. One of them was institutionalized for a period of time. One student didn't want to go on this trip at all, had to have extra watch because who knows whether she was going to run off or something. She didn't want to be there at all, but was only there because her mom made her go. And one student with an extremely rough background was not a Christian whatsoever, but was an active drug user, a known active drug user. So as we pulled out on this trip, it was like, here we go. This is going to be quite the journey. Now, the week was great. The week went well. We had many great encounters. We saw lives that were changed. We saw stories that were rewritten. Great things happened. And, the best news was that when we left, we came back with everybody but one, and that one sat in jail all week. Seriously, he sat in jail all week. And I'll come back to that story here in just a little bit, but here's what one major thing of that trip taught me. One major thing of that trip taught me that everybody is living a journey. Everybody's living some level of journey, Christian or not, but there is a journey that they're living on. And what determines the destination, what determines the outcome of somebody's journey is who it is that's leading it. That what determines the destination of someone's journey is who is leading it. Now, it would have been really easy for me to just kind of step back and look at the situations, to look at the mess of these lives, and just, that's all I see. But especially now, looking back, I can see that the reality is that people aren't issues, people aren't problems, but people are all on a journey. And the kind of leader that they're following determines the destination. So the question that we can all ask ourselves up front is, who is it that's leading the journey of your life? Like really think about that. Who is it that's really leading the journey of your life? When you make decisions throughout your week, who is it that you're following? Who is it that's leading those various decisions? We started a series this past week where we're walking through the book of Hebrews, and we just hit the introduction this past week. But we don't know who the writer was, but who they were writing to was likely a group of Jewish Christians, and Jewish Christians that were probably under some level of oppression or persecution by their Jewish leaders. And so they were thinking about stepping away from their leader. They were thinking about stepping away from Jesus, or maybe they began to doubt whether he was really everything that they had come to believe. And so they began this struggle. Now, last week we saw the credentials, and at the very beginning of the opening of this letter, we've got the author that's writing, reminding this audience the supremacy of Jesus, the importance of Jesus. That he was the one, he was the avenue who God had created all things, that in the last days that Jesus was the final word, that he was the way that God had spoken. And we also acknowledge that this book is just a heavy theological book, and it's going to be just that again today. But while we're going to wrestle with some different theological truths, we're also going to come back to a landing at the end, an application, and ask ourselves the question of who is it that's leading the journey of your life? Because just like the audience that this book is being written to, the same comes for us, that we're all on a journey, that each one of us faces some level of trial, each one of us faces some level of difficulty, and we've got to ask ourselves in those moments, who is it that's leading the journey of our life? The text that we're going to look at, it comes from chapter 2, verses 10 through 18 to start. I'm going to just read through this mouthful of a text, and then we'll go through it a little more verse by verse. Starting in verse 10. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He says, quoting from the Old Testament, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly I will sing your praises. And again I will put my trust in him. And again he says, here I am, and the children God has given me. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not the angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Now that's a mouthful. There's a lot there. And yet what we see clearly, we just kind of take a broad stroke, is we see this picture of Jesus as our leader. We see this picture as Jesus is the one to follow. And the writer does this in painting a picture of what kind of leader that Jesus is. There's 4 sections, just all synchronized, that show 4 different pictures of the kind of leader that Jesus is. Very first comes at the very beginning, and perhaps the main one, that shows a picture of Jesus as a trailblazer, Jesus as a pioneer. For look at verse 10. This is the second part. It says that they should make this pioneer of our salvation perfect. And let's just read the whole verse. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through everything exists, should make the pioneer, that's Jesus, of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. See, the author sees Jesus as a pioneer, as a trailblazer. And what a trailblazer is it's somebody that is making a path. It's making a path where no one has gone before. It's making a roadway where no one has paved before. It's kind of like the picture of I remember when I was pretty young, and it was quite a while ago because we didn't have cell phones at the time, but we were driving this old junky van, and we were going down the highway. We were in between Iowa City, Iowa, and my hometown of Grinnell, and we broke down on the side of the road. And it was just myself and my mom and my sister and a friend of hers. And there was snow on the ground, no cell phones. It was kind of that moment. I don't know what we did before cell phones. Like, well, what do we do now? And the van's broken down. Where are we going to go? And it was kind of at a quite a distance down the way. You could see there was an exit, and there was a convenience store at a gas station. And it was dark outside, mind you. It was cold, dark, and it was snowy. There was thick snow on the ground. And what my friend, or what my sister's friend did was he bundled himself up in a coat, and he made sure his shoes were up tight, and he took off running down the side of the road, heading towards this convenience store. See, what he was doing was being a pioneer. He was leading the way to get help. He was heading to go down where none of us really could have gone by ourselves at the time, and yet he was a pioneer. He was a trailblazer, leading the way to bring help. And that's what this text is saying that Jesus did, just to a much more significant extent. That Jesus was a trailblazer. He leads the way for us to pave a way that we couldn't walk by ourselves. He paves the way to new territory, because every individual on the face of the planet has the same problem. Each one of us has a sin problem. For Romans tells us all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Ever since Genesis chapter 3, we're in this cycle of rebellion where we disobey, where we continue to put ourselves in a place that's only rightful for God. We continue to put ourselves in a spot of saying, well, God, I don't know I think you're holding out on me. I think I might know what's best for my life. And each time that we make a decision such as that, we are putting ourselves on the throne and we are committing sin. And because of sin, we're separated from a holy and perfect God, starting in Genesis chapter 3. And it's because of our own evil, it's because of our own mess-ups, because of our own sin that we're destined to death and separation from God. What we desperately need is a relationship restored. What we desperately need is a relationship redeemed with a holy God. And there's only one person that was able to pave that way, to be a trailblazer, and that was Jesus. Jesus, who was without sin, became sin on our behalf. Now, without sin, maybe you're going, well, wait a minute, doesn't this text say that Jesus was made perfect? And it does, indeed. In verse 10, it says, for God, for whom and through everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect. Now, does that imply that there was a one time that he wasn't perfect? Or was there one time that he was morally like guilty? And the answer is no, that's not what this is meaning. The English language doesn't quite capture the picture here. Rather, it's a unique and it's a pretty neat word in the original language that refers much more to a person being qualified for a particular task. Someone that was able to complete this particular task. What the author is saying is that through Jesus, suffering was made perfect to be the pioneer of our salvation. Through his suffering, he led the way for us to be redeemed and restored. It was through Jesus' suffering that he led the way for us to be redeemed and restored. Jesus was qualified to be the trailblazer, to be the leader of our salvation. The second picture comes in verses 11 through 13. And we're just going to look at verse 11 here. For the verse 12 and 13 is quoting some Old Testament text that is in essence restating what verse 11 says. But here's what verse 11 says. Both the one who makes people holy, that's Jesus, and those who are made holy, that's us, are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. So what we have here is that Jesus identifies with us as our leader. He identifies. And how does he do that? He says we're part of the same family. And I love what Jeff Snell says here. He says by employing family imagery, Hebrews makes the strongest possible statement about the depth of Jesus' love for and the loyalty to God's people. See, by identifying within the culture, family was a big deal. Family was of the highest value, was of the highest priority. And so for Jesus to say, I'm not ashamed to call them my brothers and sisters. He's saying we're a part of the same family. We have the same Father. For everybody who calls God Father is a sibling of Jesus. This is Jesus identifying with us in the most intimate sense. N.T. Wright it says like this. He says that this text, it paints a picture of Jesus as sort of an older loving brother who comes to us where we are and wants to help us out of our mess. Now that's a powerful picture. Jesus being like a loving older brother who just sees the mess that we're in and wants to lovingly come in and he wants to help us out of it. Jesus identifies with us in the most intimate sense. He's not just our trailblazer. He's family. And then in verse 14 through 16, we have another picture of what kind of leader that he is. And it's the idea of Jesus being a liberator. It says this, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. See, if Jesus came into this, or the idea of Jesus being as a liberating leader is that setting people free, setting captives free, of breaking chains. And ultimately, what that chain that he breaks is this idea of fear of death. And what it says is that Satan has this power. He has the power to keep us oppressed, keep us in this slavery of this fear of death. And he does so by ultimately what Satan does is he deceives, starting in Genesis chapter 3, is he deceives. And he deceives and he deceives and he deceives and he tempts and gets us to commit sin. And we know from Romans tells us that, and what Genesis 3 tells us, is that sin leads to death. Therefore, ever since Genesis chapter 3, we have this fear of death. We have this bondage that we're in. And Jesus, through his death on the cross, he defeats sin, and through his resurrection, he defeats death. Jesus is our liberator. He is our deliverer, that we don't have to be held by the bondage of the fear of death. Now, I don't want to be clear, what this text doesn't say is that we will not die. What it says is that Jesus is our liberator from the fear of death. In spite of all the great medical advances that we have in our world, and we do have some great medical advances, they still can't deal with this problem. They can't deal with the problem of the fear of death. It's interesting that I saw a study, or I heard of a study that was looking at humanity's greatest fears. And number one was public speaking, and number two was the fear of death. And somebody jokingly said, so at a funeral, people would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. But yeah, I think we can all agree that perhaps stats can be awfully misleading, and that all of us on some level, that humanity as a whole, that what our predominant fear is this fear of death. And people fear death for many reasons, but an authentic relationship with God takes care of them all. Jesus sets us free from the bondage, and that bondage is a terrible one. Being handicapped by fear and the ultimate fear of death, it is a terrible bondage. I've been there, I am there, I struggle with that. But the hope of our faith, the hope of Christianity is to be set free from that bondage, and Jesus is our liberator. Jesus is the leader to follow. Because Jesus has blazed that trail. Because he has set us free. We don't have to fear the unknowns of death. Jesus is our liberator. And fourth, Jesus is our empathizing leader. Verse 17 and 18. For this reason, he had to be made like them, that's us. He had to be made like us, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. See, if Jesus came into this world with the picture of like what in the day when this is written, back all the Greek gods, see, all of them, they were like superhumans. See, they didn't experience things like we experience. They didn't really experience pain because they were God. They didn't experience hurt. But if Jesus was like that, if Jesus didn't experience suffering, if he didn't experience hurt, if he didn't experience trials and temptations, then he's not much like us at all. He's not very human. But what this text is saying is that he was like us in every way. He literally feels with us. This is one of the great mysteries of our faith. As we talked actually a lot more about last week at John chapter 1, it talks about Jesus becoming flesh and making his dwelling among us. And we've got pictures of Jesus saying to his disciples and to the religious leaders that if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. You have Hebrews chapter 1, the very introduction. We have that Jesus is the exact representation of God's glory. And yet, he was also fully human like us in every way. So we tend to gravitate towards the divinity side, the superhuman Jesus side. Like, he definitely had bigger muscles than all of us. He definitely had prettier hair than all of us, right? He never struggled with anything because he was superhuman, Jesus, and yet this isn't the picture that we're given within Scripture. He was like us in every way, and he suffered like us. And when we tend to gravitate towards the idea of Jesus as superhuman, then whether we'll actually say it or whether we'll subtly think it, we'll begin to think things like, God, you have no idea what it is that I'm going through. We'll be tempted to think that. And yet what God says is, yes, I do. Because as this text tells us, he himself suffered when he was tempted. He's able to help those who are being tempted. Listen to the words of Max Lucado. It's quite uncomfortable to read, actually, and yet I think it's true. Here's what he says when it comes to the humanity of Jesus. He says, angels watched as Mary changed God's diaper. The universe watched with wonder as the Almighty learned to walk. Children played in the street with him. And had the synagogue leader in Nazareth known who was listening to his sermons? He says, Jesus may have had pimples. He may have been tone deaf. Perhaps a girl down the street had a crush on him, or vice versa. It could be that his knees were bony. One thing's for sure, he was, while completely divine, completely human. For 33 years, he would feel everything you and I have ever felt. He felt weak. He grew weary. He was afraid of failure. He was susceptible to wooing women. He got colds. He burped. He had body odor. There's a picture for you. His feelings got hurt. His feet got tired. His head ached. To think of Jesus in such a light as well, it seems almost irreverent, doesn't it? It's not something we like to do. It's uncomfortable. It is much easier to keep the humanity out of the incarnation, clean the manure from around the manger, wipe the sweat off his eyes, pretend he never snored or blew his nose or hit his thumb with a hammer. See, Jesus was like us. He can empathize with our weakness. There's nothing in this world that we face that Jesus cannot sympathize with. He knows the help that we need, and he gives it. Summary, Jesus is the leader that we need in this thing called life. Summary, Jesus is the trailblazer for us on our journey. He identifies with us in our journey. He liberates us in the midst of our journey. And he feels with us through our journey. This is the leader that we follow. And the question really is, who else is worth following? Who is worthy in such a way to following like that? And we all know the answer is no one, and yet we still struggle from time to time. Some might ask, going back to my opening illustration, some might ask, why would you take a youth trip with so many unstable kids? Why on earth would you take kids across 3 states to with all those major issues? And the reality is, it's because we're all on a journey. That we all have a background, that we all have a mess. And whoever's leading us on our journey is going to determine the destination of our journey. And so if there was any possible way at all, that this girl who was pregnant out of wedlock, if there was any chance that she might come to know Jesus, which, by the way, she was a long ways from him. She had no clue. She had never stepped foot in a church hardly. She had no idea what was going on. If there was any way that she might meet this great leader to change the trajectory of her life, it was worth it. If there was any chance that this student that was addicted to drugs, if there was any chance that he might come face to face with this real leader that we have on our journey, then it was worth it. In fact, the very first night, the student I referred to that sat in jail, the very first night, by the time we finally got to Hope College in Holland, caught wind that he, no pun intended, caught wind that he maybe had some drugs on him, and we asked him, no. Can I search your stuff? Well, sure, because I have nothing. Why do they always say that? You know you're going to get caught. And so sure enough, we searched his stuff, and sure enough, he had drugs, and he's a foster child, and he threatens to leave and run away. Well, if a foster child runs and leave in another state, that's toast. That's bad news. So we only had one other option, which was to call some enforcement. And I tell you, that was one of the worst nights ever, especially the beginning of a youth conference, to watch one of your students get escorted out in handcuffs. Terrible night. And all week long, I just couldn't help but wonder, how's he doing? Couldn't help but just pray for him, and what's going on right now? And DHS ultimately came to pick him up, but we couldn't help but wonder the whole time what took place. In fact, part of me was scared to death to see him again, because he was going to be mad. And yet it was months later. It was months later that I just happened to walk in the grocery store that I went to on multiple times a week. I walked in the grocery store, and somebody hollers at me from behind the meat counter. And out comes this young man. He taps me on the shoulder, and he says, "Hey, I just want to tell you thank you. I just want to tell you thank you. I know what you were trying to do for me, and I want you to know that I found Jesus." See, the reason that we step into the mess of people's lives, the reason that we'll take change, the reason that we will take anybody on a trip like that is because we all are on a journey. Every one of us has baggage. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And what we need desperately more than anything is to come face to face with our one true trailblazing leader. See, Jesus isn't a trailblazer. He is the trailblazer. And he can sympathize, he can empathize with us in our weakness. But the question each and every one of us has to ask is, on our journey, who is it that's leading us? Because quite frankly, we have a tendency to drift. And it's tempting to say, well, I've been going to church for 25 years. I've been going to church for 40 years. I'm here every single week. Well, careful. We can attend church and still be drifting. We can be a part of a congregation and active in a church and still be drifting. See, we begin to drift when we get infatuated with the pleasures of this world, with the wealth, with the business. We begin to drift when we let our schedules get so full that it controls us and we don't control it. We begin to drift when we find our fulfillment in another human being. We begin to drift when we put our lives on coast and seize tight to the trailblazer of our salvation. Can we just go back to the beginning of chapter 2 and to hear a clear warning that the writer gives to his audience? Here's what he says: "We must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. For since the message spoken through angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs and wonders and various miracles and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. Don't miss the very first verse. This is the first warning that he gives this church, that we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard so that we do not drift away. We must hold firm to our leader. The main point is that Jesus is our trailblazer. And those who choose a different leader, those who pick a different leader are on a path to destruction. No other leader blazes a trail of true salvation. No other leader came off an eternal throne to call us siblings. No other leader paid a price that we could never repay. And no other leader can empathize with us in our journey like Jesus can. We are all on a journey, but the question is, who is it that we are following? N.T. Wright gives a great illustration of how it is that we can drift so easily without us even knowing it. He says it's like being out on water, and there's waves that are kind of crashing around, and we're in a little motorboat. And at some point, we just kind of take our foot off the gas, and the waves just begin to toss us around and move us around. And before we knew it, we are way off of where we once were. What we've got to have our foot on the accelerator in order to go through these waves, to get to the compass to where we're heading. And we have our eyes fixed on Jesus and hold firm to the author, the pioneer of our salvation. But we so easily can drift by all the different waves that take place within this world. Here's the urge, here's the message of the author of Hebrews. Hold fast, hold tight to Jesus. Hold firmly to him. Don't let him out of your sight on a daily basis, proactively, spending time in the Word, spending time in prayer, gathering with other believers, and not letting anything come in the way of that. See, it's interesting that in this world that we live right now, that it seems like gathering as believers seems to be the very first thing that can come off our schedule. Can we just be honest about that? The very first thing, like we'll go see family, that's why is important. We'll let our kids' schedules drive us around. We'll be tired. The very first thing to go isn't one of our hobby activities. The very first thing to go is gathering as believers. Hold tightly. Hold tightly to each other and hold tightly to our leader. We are all on a journey, but here's the question, the final question. I'm going to ask it one more time. I'm going to pray and we'll be done. Who is it or what that you're holding firm to on the journey of your life? Let's pray. God, I just pray that right now throughout this room and as we come into a time where we're going to sing a song, God, this song being a time for us to reflect, for us to think, for us to allow you to search our hearts. God, I just pray that you would do just that. That you would help us to fix our eyes on you, that you would help us to see the way it is that you long for us to live. God, that you would help us to show us what it looks like to hold firmly to you, that we would be able to cast aside all of the waves, that we do not drift, and that we would fix our eyes on you, and we'd plant our feet on the firm foundation, and that we'd follow you as the leader of our journey. God, we just thank you for who you are. I just pray that right now that you would search our hearts, and that you would do a good work in us, that you'd continue to spur us on towards the completion of our faith. God, you are good, and it's in you we place our trust. Pray all these things in your Son's name.